Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. Today's topic, Unfear Your Organization, Unlock Performance and Well-Being, is very relevant and timely given the speed and volume of change and uncertainty that leaders and organizations face daily. My name is Mary McCulloch, and I'm the Director of Leadership and Culture Solutions with Human Synergistics, and I'll be your host and moderator today. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. Gaurav Bhatnagar, I think, is the founder of Co-Creation Partners and has 2 decades of experience with organizations to deliver increased performance, culture transformations, and enhanced leadership development. His expertise includes creating and designing transformational programs for top teams and their frontline leaders and folks, as well as coaching hundreds of people across multiple industries. Mark Minukas is the managing partner at Co-Creation Partners, and for 15 years has helped organizations transform their business performance. He consults and coaches senior leaders and their teams to improve performance and effectiveness, as well as how to harness their talent and to increase and maximize all their employees' talent and skills to improve business results. Gaurav and Mark are McKinsey alumni, and they bring a wealth of experience and knowledge to our session today. A warm welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary.
So a couple of quick reminders. We are coming in from various locations, so if we have any delays, please be patient with us as we go through the slide deck today. We will be sharing a webinar recording and slide deck, and so keep your eye out for that over the next few days in your email follow-up. And lastly, if you have any questions, please submit them in the questions pane, and we'll address as many of those as we can today. Our speakers are co-authors of the book, Unfear, Transform Your Organizations to Create Breakthrough Performance and Employee Well-Being. They will share highlights today on how to reframe fear to create a learning culture of performance and well-being. What you might find interesting is the connection between the Unfear approach and the Human Synergistic Circumplex framework. So before we dive in, I'll provide a quick overview of the Human Synergistic Circumplex framework. So as many of you know, the Circumplex, it measures 12 styles of thinking and behavior, and it's organized around 2 dimensions. First, it looks at orientation to people or task, and second, it looks at meeting satisfaction versus security needs. So the blue constructive styles from the 11 to 2 o'clock positions, these styles focus on a balance between people and task, while emphasizing the focus on meeting satisfaction needs to achieve, to grow, to develop, and build healthy relationships. Now, there are 2 groups of styles that focus on meeting security needs. The first is passive defensive styles. These are the green styles from the 3 to 6 o'clock positions. Now, these styles emphasize maintaining personal security and safety through interactions with people, including to fit in, to follow orders, to be accepted, and to avoid blame. The last grouping is the aggressive defensive styles, and these are from the 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock positions. And these styles emphasize promoting security and safety, and actually promoting status through task-related behaviors, including to find flaws, to control others, to win at all costs, and to avoid mistakes. So with that very brief overview, I want to welcome Gaurav and Mark again and hand it over to both of you.
Thanks, Mary. It's great to be here.
You.
Gaurav.
Yeah, thanks, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mary. So I think, the book Unfair is fundamentally a book that um, started writing itself probably 20 years ago when I was still a McKinsey consultant in South Africa, and very soon realized how dysfunctional I was being with my insecure overachievement mindset and attitude. And yet, the more Mark and I worked in organizations, we realized that this word fear is such a taboo word in the workplace. And if you look at the definition of fear, there's nothing remarkable about it. It's an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous, likely to cause pain, or is a threat. And yet, when you go to the organization, hardly anyone in the boardroom wants to talk about it. And we found it really fascinating because we found that, fear is it's such a source of dysfunction and underperformance in organizations. So often what we do when we start our work is we actually start by exploring the fears of a CEO. And let me share a few with you. And this is actually a list of fears the CEO has shared with us. So Mark, if you can click on the next one. Yeah. So here are the first four that the CEO shared with us. Fear of being wrong, fear of being blamed, fear of losing control, fear of disappointing others. Pretty universal. Fear of failure, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being right about being wrong, fear of failing in marriage because you're so busy in the workplace. Mark the next one. Fear of being found out, probably one of the biggest ones that I've seen in terms of the imposter syndrome. Fear of being ridiculed, fear of being judged, fear of not being liked. As you look at this set of fears, reflect for yourself and ask yourself, which of these fears do you see in organizations, in your organization? Or even more importantly, which of these fears do you experience yourself? And really, really think about the impact it has on your behavior, the behavior of your teams, the behavior of your organization. Because fear doesn't show up in terms of people being fearful, but it shows up in behaviors, and it shows up in how people act in organizations, which is what Mark is going to share with you in just a minute. And you won't be surprised that a lot of it has resemblance with some of the human synergistics pieces. Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Gaurav. So we talk about how fear shows up in organizations as the fear archetypes, and there's a very very clean mapping to the human synergistic circumplex. But we think about it in a slightly different way, just for a couple of reasons. One is we believe that fear, if not addressed appropriately, can lead to a lot of waste and dysfunction in organizations. And so we wanted to create some language around how fear shows up in organizations. And the other is we wanted, these archetypes to really stand out for people and have people really identify, with these patterns of behavior. And we'll talk about these fear archetypes, but it's not that these archetypes are right or wrong. It's just when these archetypes tend to show up, there tends to be some fear, underlying fear that's not being addressed, and they tend to create some dysfunction. And they don't allow people to be as effective, or teams to be effective, or organizations to be as effective as they could be. So these fit into two categories. The first is the fight club. So these are the aggressive defensive styles. So when people perceive a threat, they act out, they act outwards. And the four archetypes here are, one is the fault finders. So these are people, when they perceive a threat, they find fault in other people. Right? If they're pointing out all the problems in the world or the environment, well, they're going to keep themselves safe and neutralize those threats. Then we have the controllers. So the controllers are patterns of behavior where people seek to minimize uncertainty. Right? Again, this can be a very good thing. It's a necessary thing, but any strength overplayed becomes a weakness. And so controllers can create a lot of chaos in organization. We have the competitors. So the competitor archetype is a pattern of behavior where you feel like you have to win everything. If you're winning, you're safe. If you're not winning, you're not safe. And again, that can create a lot of chaos. And then we have the perfectionists. These are, patterns of behavior where you have to get everything just right. And there's a good side of that, but then, people who fall into this archetype also can create a tremendous amount of stress for themselves and for other people. And so we've got the fight club here. On the other side, we've got the nice club. And we have a fun acronym for NICE, which is nothing in me cares enough to tell you the truth. So these are patterns of behavior where people seek to keep their head down to neutralize threats, right? If I can fade into the background and be invisible, then, I won't be harmed. And so we have the avoiders in this category. These are people that shy away from the difficult conversations or from pointing out things that really need to be pointed out. We have the minions. So this is sort of the flip side of the controller, but the minions are, it's a pattern of behavior where your only customer is the boss. People are constantly looking up in the hierarchy to see what the boss is doing and serving that hierarchy. Sticklers serve another hierarchy. These are patterns of behavior where you serve the rule book, even when the rule book isn't serving the organization or customers any longer. People default to that. And then we have likables. These are patterns of behavior where people are seeking to ingratiate themselves to other people. And the belief is if I am liked, then I'll be safe, right? And when these patterns are based on very good intentions and good values, but when they're overplayed, they can create a lot of waste and dysfunction in organizations. And there's underlying fears here. So one thing we try to do in organizations is help individuals and teams and organizations understand how these fear archetypes may be operating in their organization. And so one thing we'd like to do with you all, just to make this a little bit interactive, is to have you put into chat which one or two fear archetypes do you feel are most prevalent in your organization. Yeah, and we'll have a quick chat about some of the most prevalent ones that show up in chat. But what are the one or two fear archetypes that are most prevalent in your organization? Just drop those into chat. I'll put this slide back up here so you can reference this.
All right, well, I'm taking a look. I haven't seen any yet. Again, insert those into the chat field if you want. Again, what two archetypes have you seen is most prevalent in your organization? Maybe people aren't experiencing these archetypes. What's the chance of that, right?
Yeah. Gaurav and I, we do very interactive workshops, so we find it very difficult to just talk at people. We always want to make things as interactive as possible when we can. So,
What are some of the common pairs that you've noticed? Maybe that's what we could approach, just to highlight a couple of the common pairs, since we're not seeing any submitted yet.
Yeah, well, if people want to submit, they can. But we find it probably varies by industry and level in the organization at times. So we do work across the private sector and the public sector. I find there's a difference in the general pattern there. In the private sector, particularly the financial services industry or consulting industry, you tend to see a lot of the fight club, a lot of competitive behaviors, a lot of fault finding behaviors in those environments. In the public sector, I tend to see a lot of avoiders and stickler patterns. And then maybe in the nonprofit world, we do work there. There tends to be kind of an avoider, maybe even a likable, kind of go along to get along vibe in some of those organizations. And again, they're all based on good intentions, but they can create their own chaos and ineffectiveness at times. And I tend to see, with more senior leaders in organizations, there tends to be more of that fight club energy. And sometimes lower down in the organization, there tends to be a little bit more of a nice club energy, right? And there's very good reasons for that. But again, if that's all that's going on in the organization, organizations can get stuck.
Mhm.
Yeah, so Mary, to your question, I think the one which I typically see is the brotherhood of controllers and minions. That tends to be a pair that comes together often,
Mhm. Mhm. So
and it's mutually negatively reinforces each other.
right, they keep, it's a dance. It ends up becoming a dance, right? That they're playing together. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Interesting.
speaking of the dance, we should talk a little bit about this vicious fear cycle. So what's going on in the organization, and why are these archetypes so pernicious? When we view, or experience fear as there's something threatening in the environment, right? We perceive this threat. If the fear archetypes are what's showing up, we either have avoided or aggressive conversations. And either way, there's some short-term relief, right? I either speak my mind and, jump on someone, and, that feels good in the moment, or I avoid the conflict in the moment, and there's some short-term relief, but then there's lowered trust and safety longer term, which then just perpetuates this dynamic. And so that's how fear drives waste and dysfunction in organizations. And like Gaurav mentioned, this is very taboo, right? I think a lot of people, when we talk about this stuff, they say, oh yeah, like there is a lot of fear in my organization, but nobody talks about it very directly, right? It's not really named. It's just people recognize the patterns, but they don't name it. And so part of what we're trying to do is help people name it, because that's part of the game here and part of the way out. So a couple of key takeaways on fear that we want to leave you with to start. One is that fear sort of works insidiously and is often invisible. And it's there. If we're honest, we can acknowledge it, but it's invisible. It's working beneath the surface. It does drive short-term performance. Let's be honest. I mean, when these fear archetypes show up, there is a short-term performance bump, particularly when the fight club energy is there. You can get a lot done, but it also creates a lot of waste and dysfunction longer term in organizations. And we believe that's a source for underperformance. We believe that's a source for lack of human well-being in organizations, high turnover. And so fear becomes this key leverage point for how you can improve both performance and well-being in organizations. And there are approaches out there to address fear, but we think a lot of the current approaches are either simple or misguided. So let's explain here. So one is just to accept the status quo. Some people say, yeah, well, there's fear, but that's just how organizations work, right? Just live with it, deal with it. And like we talked about, there is a short-term performance bump. You can come in as a leader and be very aggressive and get things done. But oftentimes the organization remains blind or numb to these fear archetypes and the long-term damage that they can create. And so that doesn't really work. There's this other idea, which is creating fearless organizations, right? There's this idea that maybe you can just eliminate fear and have people feel perfectly safe in the work environment. And while we think there's really good recommendations associated with that body of research and that line of work, we do think it's a little bit limited for a few reasons. One is there's a real focus on formal leaders. So formal leaders obviously have a really important role, but it often neglects the role of informal leaders in the organization. And in our experience, you can't create real system level change unless both formal and informal leaders in the organization are changing how they show up. So you need to do both. The other is they categorize fears and work on them separately. And we just, fear is just sort of woven into the fabric of how we experience life as human beings. And you can't just parse out different fears and deal with them separately. It needs to be a very holistic approach. And there's also this implication that fear is bad and can or should be eliminated. And if there's one big idea we leave you with today, it's that fear isn't bad, it just is. And so we have to change our relationship to fear, not just eliminate fear. And so that's what we'll talk about next, is how do you unfear an organization? Gaurav.
Beautiful. Yeah, so I think that the biggest assertion that we're making is that fear itself is not the problem, which I think if we just take a moment to reflect on it, we think to be human is to have fear. It's more our relationship to fear and how we engage with fear that either can be an opportunity or a challenge. And therefore, obviously, our solution, which is why we wrote a whole book, is Unfear, which, by the way, is not a word in the English language. It is a word that we created because we didn't quite think fearless describes it. It's not about eliminating fear, as Mark was saying, but it's about changing our relationship to fear. So here's a couple of definitions of unfear. So as a verb, unfear means to reframe fear to be a cue for learning and growth. So how do you reframe your relationship to fear to see it as a learning, as a cue for learning and growth? And the other, which is as a noun, is a choice to develop self-mastery in the face of adversity. So if it is about reframing of fear, how do you go about doing it? And the way we talk about it in the book is we talk about two fundamental superpowers that we have as human beings that differentiate us from other species. The first is our power of imagination, and the other is our power of language. Think about it. It is a really, really profound thing. We as a species have this amazing ability to create stories in our mind about everything. And through these stories, we perceive things and we create things, which we then put in place through language. And so the idea of unfair is to reframe our stories and then language them in a way that allows us to create something new and different. And by the way, this is a superpower because it's truly magical. Imagine Mark and I talk to Mary at Human Synergistics, and we all come up with an idea. We imagine, hey, we should do a Human Synergistics podcast on unfair. And wow, we have 60 odd people jumping onto a call so that they can listen to us talk about unfair. It is so brilliantly magical that we think of it as something very ordinary today. But it is really, really important because what it teaches us is that we have the power to reframe our relationship to fear. And when we do that, we create learning and growth. And when we do that, we create what are called unfair archetypes, which in the human syllogistic language would be equivalent of the constructive styles. We call these the wise club or the learning archetypes. And again, you will notice that we've simplified some of the language around the human synergistics archetypes, which often for the people we work with, it feels to be quite a mouthful. And these four archetypes are the following. The first one is achievers. What is the achiever archetype? The achiever archetype is fundamentally about discipline of management routines, discipline of problem solving, discipline that allows us to achieve without getting caught up in the dysfunction of fear and really moving the organization and ourselves forward. Seekers, which is the self-actualizing aspect of the human synergistic circumplex, is all about people who are self-starters. People who don't need to be told what to do, people who are curious, who are continuously improving, continuously learning, and really are pushing the envelope so that they can continuously enhance the effectiveness of an organization. The next one is coaches, which is the humanistic encouraging piece, which is all about development and learning and really creating a system and creating individuals who understand that the job of leadership is the job of coaching and developing. And finally, it's about building trust. So the trust builders, which is fundamentally about how do you make the team more important than the individual? How do you build trust and connection that binds us together rather than pulls us apart? And our work is all about how do you move people from the fear archetypes, the 8 archetypes that Mark mentioned, to these unfair archetypes of the wise club, and how do you truly transform the thinking? Because often what happens is when the the fundamental transformation that required is moving from a fear-based thinking to a wisdom-based thinking or a confidence-based thinking, which is, in our words, the unfair thinking. And when that happens, that's when you unlock truly fun, amazing performance as well as employee well-being. And the process we use is an inside-out transformation. So what is inside-out transformation? First of all, the inside-out transformation takes management theory and turns it on its head. It says if you want desired result, what you need to do is you need to shift. Mark, if you can click the next two. You need to shift actions that people are doing. And more fundamentally, you need to shift mindset. So what we argue is the starting point for getting new desired results is shifting at a being level. Shifting the mental models that we have that actually hold us back, because our actions are a direct result of the mental models we have related to fear. It could be that we take fear and we start behaving like victims. And what we really need to do is we really need to move from being a victim into moving into a state of mastery, which then allows us to not look at the situation we are in as something we are stuck in, but it allows us new action that gives us desired results. And we do that first at an individual level, because we believe that organizations don't transform, individuals do. And when a critical mass of individuals transform, the organization transforms by itself. And we call this idea the angel in the stone. Why the angel in the stone? Because it is said that Michelangelo once said that he saw an angel in the stone and he set to carve it free. It's a profound idea because it does not see individuals as full of fault, being defective, but argues that the fundamental orientation that we need to have as individuals is that we have infinite potential that allows us to foster self-mastery and non-defensiveness and a learning orientation, which then leads to behaviors, habits that drive self-effectiveness. But it is a profound shift and reframing that fear is actually a cue for us to rediscover our potential rather than we are messed up, screwed up people that someone else needs to fix. And when we can create enough of this community of people who truly can see the angel within themselves, because all you're doing is removing the stone because the angel is already there, then you can go and create truly, truly powerful, high-performing teams, which we in the book talk about as the jazz ensemble. It is a team where when something goes wrong, people don't stop and say, why the hell did you do this wrong? But when something goes off, people say, wow, what is the possibility available in that situation? It's about creating strong relationships and high performance in the face of stress, in the face of things not always going right, because you create beautiful music when you're able to do that. One of the things we talk about, in truly the unfair mindset in teams is that teams that are in the unfair mindset move away from I'm right, you're wrong, to a mindset of what is effective versus ineffective. These are teams that are able to engage in difficult conversations because they're not judgmental. They're not about taking positions, but it's about curiosity to evolve and develop and dance together to create something new and special. And when that happens, then you can truly get into transforming the organization, which Mark will cover.
Yeah, thanks, Gaurav. Yeah, I used to just give a little bit of background history on myself. I used to jump straight to the organizational level. I used to think the only way you can create change in organizations is by changing, the processes, by changing the organizational structures, by changing the incentive systems, and that's all important. But if I've come to believe in this inside-out way of transforming because it works. I found that when you jump straight to the organizational level, and don't address what's going on with individuals and teams, whatever you try to create at the organizational level just doesn't stick. And so once you can create that critical mass of individuals and teams, then you can start to really transform the organization. And so the metaphor we play with in our book is the journey of 1,000 heroes. It's a play on Joseph Campbell's hero with 1,000 faces. And what we invite leaders to consider is how do you, rather than creating this adult to child relationship, whether you're either trying to protect people or control people, how do you unleash the creative talents of a whole organization and create much more of an adult-adult relationship in the organization? And how do you create the conditions and an environment where people are stretching because they're excited about what's ahead, not because they're afraid of what's behind them? And how do you create really powerful learning routines and stories that get people to work with discipline, but also with a degree of openness and collaboration as they strive for higher and higher goals? So there's a lot of things that obviously fit into this organizational and systems category, but it's built on some fundamental mindsets that leaders hold about the people in their organization and how they relate to them and how they can move through some of the fears that they may have. And so this is the inside out transformation. And so there's a natural question here, I'm sure, which is, well, what does this look like in practice, right? This is a little bit abstract. So we can walk through just at a high level some work that we've done recently with a financial services company. So one of the leaders there wanted to create a deeper level of psychological safety in the organization. There was a low level of trust and people just weren't speaking up. And so what we often do in these journeys is we identify a couple of cohorts of people. We talked about creating change both with formal leaders, but also informal leaders. So we had two cohorts, formal leaders, informal leaders, moving through this journey together. So it wasn't just about the leaders and how they're showing up, it's about how a critical mass of people in the organization are showing up. And step one was discovery. So this is where we made really good use of the human synergistics tools, the OCI and the LSI tools, if anybody's familiar with those, but one is for the team organizational level and the other was for individuals. And through a mix of interviews and focus groups and the use of these survey tools, we helped the organization really understand what was going on today and how is that different than what their ideal state was. And so there was a real gap. There was a lot of fear archetypes that were showing up in the organization that, once we showed them the data and some of the insights from the interviews and focus groups, it became much clearer. And the gap between where they were and where they wanted to go was clear. So that's the discovery phase. The second we describe as activation. So in order to do an inside out transformation, you really have to slow people down and help them see for themselves how they're showing up and why they're showing up. And so we took both the formal leaders and the informal leaders through a series of workshops so they can work on themselves and understand how fear was driving them and how fear was creating those fear archetypes in terms of how they were showing up, but also to get them to think about how it was they wanted to shift. So this isn't just a matter of awareness, but people have to choose for themselves how they want to show up differently. And so the workshops that we created help bring those formal and informal leaders to a point of choice about how they wanted to show up differently as leaders in this system. And together, the formal and the informal leaders created a series of actions and new working norms for their organization that they wanted to go off and use. And so the next phase was something we call test and learn. And we describe it as test and learn because more often than not, we don't have all the right answers up front. So they made some choices about what it was they wanted to change, and they went off and tried them. Some worked, some didn't, and they've continued to evolve these working norms and patterns of how they collaborate and communicate. And we're now getting close to the point where we'll do another set of surveys in the organization to truly measure the results. And everything we've heard so far is there's been a tremendous shift in terms of how people show up and how energized people are in the organization. There's much higher levels of trust, there's better communication, and there really is a higher degree of psychological safety. And interestingly, people still talk about all the things that are creating fear. There's still uncertainty in the marketplace. There's still stressors. There's still challenges, right? Those didn't go away, but how they're relating to those fears is fundamentally different. And that's the key point at which we intervened in the system, and we believe it makes a really big difference.
Yeah, so 20 years ago, if someone had given me a book called Unfair, I would have probably thrown it promptly into the dustbin because I was joylessly successful. And I thought that the only way of being was to be an insecure overachiever. My journey over the last 20 years has been about moving from joylessly successful to being successfully joyful. And in that, actually helping organizations achieve amazing levels of performance and employee well-being. And last year, when Mark and I were in South Africa and talking to the gentleman called Martin, who we met at the edge of the forest, he said something which was really, really profound. And that's the way we end the book. And that's the way we'd like to end this talk. He said, fear is just love that has forgotten itself. Fear is just love that has forgotten itself. And we'd like you to reflect on that. And we'd like to say good luck to all of you, because I think we're all on this journey of unfair. Thank you.
Yeah, that quote is one definitely that offers some food for thought for reflecting. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I do want to say before we go into, we've gotten a lot of questions, and we also found a lot of contributions for the archetypes were in the questions. So I want to read a couple of them before we go in, just so we can acknowledge some of these, because people really did contribute. So thank you for contributing.
Yeah,
so here's one: likables and perfectionists is a pair for this client.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
We also have, let's see here, there's a few others here.
By the way, the likable perfectionist pairing is interesting. It sort of brings to mind an environment where I wonder if people take all the stress on themselves, but then try to create a really nice veneer to other people. And so I could imagine that might be a tremendously stressful place to work, where people secretly are feeling like other people aren't pulling their weight, but can't talk about it in a very open way.
Well, and here's another interesting combination: fault finders and perfectionists.
Yeah, that one I'm not as surprised by, right? I mean, a lot of perfectionists then actually either with themselves or with other people tend to go to fault finding, because that's a default reaction that happens to why isn't everything perfect?
Yeah.
And let me tell you what are all the things you've done wrong. Now go fix it, which actually with good intention often deflates the energy in a system.
Yeah, perfectionists are often fault finders of themselves. So it's just where are you pointing the fault finding energy at yourself or other people?
Yeah. Here's another one: sticklers, especially in financial services. Was the sticklers? I don't see a second one there. Oh, and then that they also like to be perfect. So I guess the perfectionist and the sticklers, financial services.
Yeah, in organizations where there's a lot of risk management and a lot of fear about what might happen if someone was to make a wrong decision, can often become stickler organizations. And again, there's some good elements to that. I think there's, you need to have the right playbook. You need to have, you need to learn from your past mistakes and make sure that those mistakes aren't repeated. I think the challenge is sometimes the playbook becomes an excuse to not really look at a situation on its own merits, and it can oftentimes shut down problem solving and creative thinking if it's not held in the right way.
Yeah, I'll share one last pairing: likables and avoiders.
Likables and avoiders. Yeah, because you don't want to upset the apple cart, right? I mean, so yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, likables and perfectionists. I have to do another one there. There's a lot of good ones. So thank you everyone for contributing
Thank you.
the archetypes. Now moving to some questions, because we did get a lot of questions from our audience today. So let's start with this first one. In your work, do you typically start with the senior level leaders before moving down through the organization, or is there a certain pattern or way that you approach the work?
Mark, you want to take that? You want me to take that?
Go for it. I'll jump in.
Yeah, so we do typically start with senior leadership because you have to meet the organization where it is. And often the senior leadership typically wants to feel that there's some value in the work before you can move anywhere else. But very quickly in our work, we go from senior leadership to looking at the cross section of the organization and moving to a non-hierarchical way of working with the organization.
Mm-hmm.
So we create a coalition between formal leaders and informal leaders very quickly to do the work.
Yeah, and just one thing I would add there is oftentimes that work ends up happening in parallel. So there'll be a work stream focused on the senior leadership and then a work stream focused on the broader set of people in the organization. And there's some interplay there between the two. Yep.
Got it. So parallel paths, so to speak. Okay, perfect. Here's another question. Can you say more about the results of your approach? How has fear been demonstratively reduced or driven out from the organization that you've helped?
Yeah, Gaurav, why don't you jump in here and then I'll build on you.
So if you were to buy the book, which we would strongly recommend you do, the last chapter of the book is a case study, which is a case study based in at the Wyandotte side of BASF, which is a chemical manufacturing organization, where we've done a lot of work around unfearing that organization. And just tangible business results, it led to almost a 6x improvement in performance by doing this work. But fundamentally, what we did there was really empower the organization to find the improvement ideas rather than just assume what the expert said would be the answer. And we use then the OCI to measure the movement from fear to unfear, because to us, any movement from aggressive defensive or passive defensive behavior to constructive behavior is a sign of movement from fear to unfear archetype. So at a behavioral level, we use the OCI to demonstrate it, and we have multiple examples of organizations that have done that. But then we also try and link it to business performance and try and link it to how the organization, with an initial benchmark of what could have been possible if you had gone with a traditional outside-in transformation, go to an inside-out transformation, what is the lift in performance you get? So again, BASF is a great study. We've done similar work at Alcoa, and there are a few other organizations that we don't have permission to name, but we've done it across industries, and we seem to see very similar results.
Yeah, just the only thing I might add there is it's quite important to make sure any unfear effort is grounded in solving a business problem as well, or a business performance problem. So it's not just about improving the culture in the organization. That's obviously quite important, but the culture is in service of business results that the organization wants to see, and that could result in higher revenue, better profit, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that aligns well with a lot of what we talk about too, is always aligning the work back to what is the business objective or the priorities, and how do we tie in culture and leadership to that. Right?
Yep.
Here's an interesting question. Do you see that organizations tend to recruit and promote people with the same kind of fear archetypes?
Yeah. I think they do. These fear archetypes do become a little bit self-perpetuating in organizations or cultures. So people tend to get rewarded for the dominant archetype, and the people who don't fit in either are asked to leave or they choose to leave themselves. And so that further reinforces, the people who are left and who they want to promote. So I do think there is a bit of a reinforcing loop there that organizations do get stuck in. And it does take, a lot of intentionality to break that pattern. and it requires the input and involvement of the HR function as well as hiring managers, but it has to be a real deliberate effort.
Okay. Another question, have you found any differences between men and women in how they handle fear?
Such a dangerous question. Such a dangerous question.
I'm going to say no in my experience. It's not a distinction that I necessarily am aware of. I think there's quite a bit of variation between men and women from what I've seen in terms of how they show up. I think it has more to do with their life experiences, the organizations they tend to work in, how they've been promoted and rewarded over time. But I think that's less of a gender thing. It has just more to do with their personal backgrounds.
I agree with Mark. I'm not touching that with a barge pole.
Gonna go with that one. All right, that's good. That's good. Here's another question. What conversational skills and practices do you use to engage individuals and teams in beginning to unfear their workplace? So it's what are those conversational skills and practices to help people start to shift to unfear?
So I think the first thing is we do not start with conversational skills and practices. We start with intrapersonal practices, because before you can get to conversational skills, you actually need to understand your relationship to fear. And if you want to shift your conversation, you first need to shift the stories that lead to those conversations. So the first step is more the intrapersonal step of what is the story I have in my head about what does it mean to survive, and then shift it to something else. And then we get into the conversational practices. And a lot of those conversational practices are to move away from this attitude of right and wrong, move away from the attitude of being problem focused to solutions orientation, move away from practices of having a negative mindset going into the conversation, making assumptions about other people, to truly move into a space of openness that allows for a new way of conversation to happen. But there's a whole set of skills around that. But it is fundamentally about not making assumptions about yourself or the other person that then allows you to have a different way of engaging.
Yeah, I think the core skill there is becoming much more curious about the stories we get stuck in. Right? We need stories to move through the world about ourselves and other people and relationships, but we often hold those stories as the truth rather than a version of the truth. And so a real powerful skill, it's probably a work of a lifetime, is to hold those stories with more curiosity. You got to boil down to that. I mean, that's really what it is.
Yeah, great. So let's see, I think we can get 2 more questions in, some really terrific questions. Let's see here. What are the do you see a typical mindset shift in leaders? Like as you work with them, do you find there's a typical pattern or shift of leaders moving to unfear?
Yeah, so I think here's the interesting thing. I think often leaders get into positions of leadership not because of their unfair mindsets, but rather because they have, through typically aggressive defensive styles, been able to drive performance. And so a lot of the shift in mindset that we see in leaders is moving from this attitude of being a victim to being in mastery, which then gets manifested in many different ways. And what is the shift from victim to mastery? The shift from victim to mastery is the victim says, I have no choice, right? And mastery is no matter what the circumstance, I cannot shift my circumstance, but I always have a choice in how I choose to respond. And so the fundamental shift is helping people understand and helping leaders understand that they have a choice. Because when people and leaders understand they have a choice, they really step into their power. They become truly effective and powerful. They don't give up their power to the situation, to the context, to other people. And that's when the magic happens.
Mhm. Mhm.
Which is a bit counterintuitive in some ways, because I think some people may imagine a really aggressive leader and may not associate that leader with having a victim mindset. But oftentimes, the leader
Mm.
who's acting very aggressively in their own mind are saying, look, I have no choice. I have to be this way. I have to treat people this way because that's the only way I'll be successful, whatever the story is.
Right.
And that's a story they're telling themselves, and they're limiting how effective they really can be given that story. And so there really is a lot of victim energy in some of these aggressive styles, but it's not
And,
obvious on the surface.
and Mary, I'll tell you this very frankly. 20 years ago, I was a corporate bully, and
Mm.
I was a corporate bully because I was absolutely convinced from a victim stance that that's the only way I could be if I wanted to be successful.
Mhm. And you
And
probably were successful.
I was exceptionally
Yes.
successful and exceptionally unhappy. But
Yes.
but that is the story I had in my head.
Mhm.
And because I was collapsed into that is the nature of corporations and I cannot do anything else, I was stuck there. So the whole journey became about how do I actually life slapped me on my face before I could actually reflect on it. But how could I move to a different place?
Mhm. Mhm. Well, appreciate you being so transparent and sharing a little bit about your own journey and your own story, because I think people can really appreciate that we all have our journeys of growth and development. There's one last question I just want to wrap it up with on questions, and that is, with your inside out approach, how cost effective is this? Because there's an emphasis on the individual, and there's a curiosity of how do you make this cost effective if you're starting at the individual level?
Mark?
Love that question. I think it's quite cost effective for a couple of reasons. One is we're not saying you have to transform every single individual in the organization. We talk about it as transforming a critical mass of individuals. And so the formal leaders do carry a lot of energy in the organization. So you really only need maybe another 10% of the organization to transform before you can kind of create that chain reaction. So that's one way to look at it. It's not like you have to work with every single person in the organization. The other is a lot of this work is, true to the name of our organization, Co-Creation Partners, it's co-creative with people in the organization. So it's not like they have to spend a lot of money with big consulting teams who are off in a back room cranking out analyses, right? This is really sitting down with people in the organization, helping them work through their issues, and helping them come up with their own answers with support. So it can be very, very cost effective, and the return on investment, again, when you're particularly when you point an Unfear effort at a business problem, becomes very compelling.
Mm-hmm.
So Mary, I have a slightly cheekier answer. My answer is the way this works is by identifying the right people to go through the program, and the right people are the wrong people. So which is a counterintuitive thought. I mean, classically in organization, troublemakers are classified as the ones we don't want to work with. In our work, we work with the troublemakers because they have the greatest influence in the organization. And when we work with the troublemakers, we multiply our impact because when they shift, the projection and the shadow of that is such a wide shadow that we don't need to work with the majority.
Oh, quite
But
interesting.
often organizations get stuck in, oh, we have to have our high potentials and this and that. And you say, no. Focus on the influencers, focus on the people who everyone goes to, because that is where the energy sits.
That makes total sense. Terrific. Well, again, thanks everyone for participating in the questions and everything. I'd like to thank both of you, Mark and Gaurav, on your presentation and sharing your approach to transforming leaders and teams. And if anyone is interested in getting more information or finding out more, they have questions about the topics today, feel free to reach out to Shobha at Co-Creation Partners. And if you're interested in any of the human synergistics solutions around leadership development and culture change, feel free to reach out to me. I say thank you to both of you again, and thanks to everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.